In this presentation, what I'm really going to talk about is the power of talk in developing understanding about being a writer. So it's rather strange that writing's the focus of my research, but today's session is all about talk. What am I really hoping to explore with you? It's very much about how do you make children become more consciously aware, and that's that sort of metacognitive awareness of the language choices that they're making in writing. How can you support them in thinking about the relationship, that critical relationship that exists between a choice that you make in language and the effect that it has in the text, in your own writing, or indeed in the reading text that you're looking at? And looking at that relationship between, there are things that I want to communicate as an author. This is what I want this text to do. How do I make sure that the reader, my implied reader or my known reader, depending on who the audience is, will receive that thing that I'm hoping to try and communicate them with? And I'm going to talk particularly about this idea of Metatalk, which is essentially a word that our team has taken from second language learning. And I'll talk more specifically about that later, because it encapsulates the kind of talk that I'm going to be talking about throughout this session, the talk that is about why we've made certain choices. So it's more about the language than it is about the content of the writing. And both have their place, of course. So it's heightening their sense of being authors. How can we make the children that we teach, in the classrooms that we teach, feel that what they say in their written text has value in its own right, and that they as authors have that choice and that control over how they create their text. So that's really the focus of it. Throughout it, I've got particularly discussion activities, which fit with the focus itself on talk, but also I'm going to ask you to do some writing, because actually in order to talk about writing, you need to have some writing to talk about. But I start by framing what I'm going to talk about in practical terms in the classroom, but by just giving you some of the bigger sense of that idea of the metalinguistic awareness that we're talking about, and how it sits with an approach to the teaching of writing that we've been developing at the University of Exeter in our centre. So really what I'm talking about today is going meta. And I'm sure that you're already aware of the importance of metacognition, the capacity to reflect on and think about your own thinking and learning across the entire curriculums. This isn't a literacy thing, it's a life thing. Again, there's a lot of research that shows the importance of how can we foster metacognition in writing? How can we make our young writers, our developing writers, more metacognitively aware? What we've done that I think is quite distinctive is look at the metalinguistic aspect of metacognition. Most of the work on metacognition in writing looks at how we help learners to manage and self-regulate the writing process. How do you manage getting stuck? How do you manage the planning process? How do you manage drafting and revision? And all of that is very, very important. I'm not going to be talking about it at all, but I don't want to suggest it's not important, because we're going down that other pathway. And to an extent, we would argue that that aspect of metacognition in writing is process-focused. It's focusing on the process of producing the text and how you manage that. Whereas the metalinguistic aspect of thinking is text-focused. It's looking at the text, not just once it is produced, but the text in production, and trying to generate that confidence and capacity to think about and understand the choices that you make and how you shape and craft the text to suit your authorial intention and to meet the reader's needs. Focusing in on metalinguistic understanding, what we're really interested in is developing an attention to grammar, which is really where linguistics comes in. Not so much about telling children how they should write, you need to do this, you must do that, but about showing them what we call the repertoires. In fact, we've talked about the repertoires of infinite possibilities, because one of the wonderful things about language is there is just an infinite possibility of ways in which you could tell a story, write an argument, frame a sentence, but making them more aware of that repertoire of choices and discussing the way that those choices each subtly shift the kind of meanings that you're creating. And my not and but here come from a very English or England perspective, and it may not have quite the same in resonance in Australia or in South Australia, but in England, where we've got a very heavy emphasis on grammar in the primary curriculum in particular now, one of the consequences of that is an overemphasis on the labelling aspect of grammar, the naming and the identifying, and not enough on that sense of what's the point of this? Why would you want to use it? And it's also leading to some teaching which is rather formulaic, which says make sure you can get a fronted adverbial in, and that's been kind of iconic at the moment in England. So I would say it's not about you should use fronted adverbials to make your writing better. But what we're really trying to get at is, well, what happens if you shift that adverbial there to the front of your sentence? How does it change what you're trying to say? Or alternatively, if you shift that fronted adverbial there and move it elsewhere in the sentence, how does it change what you're trying to say? We're really looking at that sense of understanding the consequences of the choices that we make. And that explicit grammatical understanding and awareness is developing that metalinguistic understanding about writing. What I want to just look at now is this approach where we're looking at how do we embed the teaching of grammar purposefully into the teaching of writing so that we don't have decontextualized grammar, and certainly so you don't have too many lessons where you're identifying and naming. And we've framed these as 4 pedagogical principles, which very conveniently have the acronym LEAD. And we've encouraged the teachers that we've worked with to try and think about all of their engagement with the teaching of language and language choices, and in our case, the explicit teaching of the grammatical metalanguage, to really think about it in terms of these 4 pedagogical principles. The first one is this idea of connectivity, that if you're going to use a grammar term or talk about a language choice, what's the point of that in the context of the teaching that you're doing? So making a link between the grammar that you're introducing and how it works in the writing. And the reason for that is making it a purposeful learning reason. That it's not simply about putting things in or labelling things, it's about linking meaning and rhetorical effect. And we would also say that you could take out grammar, I know there are some secondary teachers here too, and replace that with literary metalanguage, because the exact same thing happens there, where how do we teach children what metaphors do in a text rather than that metaphors are in the text. The second principle is this one of examples, and this was because we were finding too many lessons that we were seeing were just getting bogged down in grammar and becoming mini grammar lessons. So explaining the grammar through examples, not through lengthy explanations. And one of the things that I know you do here, that you find that I've also got in my PowerPoint, is simply the use of colour as a way of colour coding, and that you've got a consistent, agreed colour coding for different aspects of grammar. And that is one of the things that we try to encourage our teachers to do a lot. But it's not just the colour coding, it might be through manipulation, through card sorts on the table, or it might be through comparing 2 versions of something where you're being clear about what the examples are. So it really allows access to the grammatical structure, even if the grammar concept isn't fully understood. And I think that's important. We've got quite a lot of evidence in primary in particular of where this approach has been used, of the transfer happening in the child's writing, that they're successfully making the kind of choices that we've been focusing on, but they can't name the grammar. And we've kind of got some evidence that sometimes transfer into writing occurs before you get the explicitness of being able to name and identify it. Our curriculum in England assumes the opposite. You teach it, then they transfer it. We feel that examples is a quite important strand to make sure that all children can access the point you're making, even if they don't necessarily have the abstract concept of the grammar fully absorbed. Then the third one is the use of authentic texts. One of the things we're so lucky with as teachers is that in terms of texts written for children and young people, there's no shortage of absolutely wonderfully written texts to suit every interest that we can use as models for teaching, but also real-world texts, that if you're teaching some non-fiction texts, the real world is full of texts that we can use as examples. And the reason that we want that is because it makes sure that children and young people as writers are being introduced to what we call that broader community of writers, the kind of choices that other writers, real writers, published writers have made. And so we're really trying to get at that sense of they are part of that community with the right to make authorial choices. It was also to get away from what we've called, before Trump talked about fake news, fake texts. We've had incidents where teachers, for the best reasons in the world, have written their own text to exemplify a particular language point they want to teach. And the trouble with that is sometimes it doesn't work in that text. It's ever so easy to overdo it. It isn't authentic. And we say, well, if you can't find a real text that does this thing that you want to teach, perhaps you're not teaching the right thing. So you have to really think about that. And it's partly about that sense of schooled writing, sometimes generating its own ways of working that are divorced from the realities of real world writing. So we really stress those authentic texts. And then the discussion, the high quality dialogic discussion, where there won't be right answers, but lots of possibilities for the exploration of the effect of a particular choice, which links a lot to the discussion of the effect of literary choices too. So there's a lot of parallels between literary and linguistic metalanguage. And for us, in the studies that we've done, it became increasingly clear that the talk was a key thing for that transfer of learning. You can do all of the others pedagogically, but it's the talk that seems to move the child from simply being able to tell you what you've told them to being able to make it a choice of their own and decide whether they want to use it or not and make it meaningful. So that's critical. And it's that strand that we're looking at today, that discussion strand of those other principles. But you need to see what I'm talking about Metatalk in the context of those other principles as well. It's now writing time for you. So if you could all get some pen, paper, digital technologies in front of you, what I want you to do individually is just think of a place that you love or where you feel happy. And it doesn't matter where it is. It could be in your kitchen or it could be an exotic paradise island. So there's no value placed on what you choose. It's just somewhere that you know you feel really happy, comfortable, and at ease. It could be ordinary or very special. And just imagine yourself in that place. And if you want to, just close your eyes to really picture it. Really think through it. Visualize it. What are the colours that you see in that place? What objects, what things are in that place? Are there people in that place? Is that what's making it special? If so, who are they? And what is it you love about those people being in that place? What's the light and the dark like in that place? Listen to it. What are the noises that you hear or don't hear? Perhaps it's the quietness that makes it special. Smell it. What are the smells of that place? So really give yourself an intense reminder. Sit yourself mentally in that place and reimagine it in your mind's eye. And in a moment, I don't want you to do this until I actually ask you to start writing, because I want you to do that visualizing first. I'm going to ask you to free write, which means to write without actually thinking about what's going to come next, or even thinking about whether it's the best word possible, not thinking about your spelling. So it's like a brain dump of getting everything out onto the page. Nobody is going to read it. This will be just for you. We will be doing something with it later, but this is just for you, so there should be no fears around this, but just use it as an opportunity to get out onto the page your thinking. And what normally happens is that as you write, more ideas come to you. If you can't think of more ideas to write, write the same thing again and again and again. What you mustn't do is stop writing in order to think. So you keep writing. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds of real quiet just to do the second bullet point, and then I'll ask you to free write. So just visualize. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Just write. Let your pen take your imagination, or your fingers take your imagination for a walk. And remember, you don't stop writing. So if you can't think of anything else to say, you write again what you've just said. one of the things that's really important is we can't move too quickly to the shaping and the making choices and the crafting of the writing until you've got something to say. Part of that's about will and part of it's about the thrill. One of the strands of the research that we've done is on creative writing, which is in some ways seems as far away as you could possibly imagine from grammar. And I take great delight in getting the word creative and grammar next to each other in sentences, because we've worked with a creative writing organisation where teachers go on residential experiences to work with professional writers on their own writing. It's actually a transformative experience for the teachers who go. One of the things that this organisation wanted to know was, has any impact on their children that those teachers teach? Because they felt, well, if we make teachers really confident about themselves as writers, that will transfer to the classroom and children will become more confident as writers. And in the first study that we did, which was a big statistical study with a control group as well as the group who are involved in the residential, it actually had a negative effect, which was really upsetting for the organisation. And we were trying to explain, look, you mustn't be upset. It doesn't mean that the experience is bad. It means that it didn't transfer to the classroom. And we looked at all the data. One of the reasons it didn't transfer was that teachers stopped explicit teaching of writing. So the children in the control group still got lots of explicit teaching of writing. But what the teachers in the intervention group did was focused on all the fun elements. But what did happen, and because we've gone on to do further studies since to look at this, what did happen was there was a major change in children's motivation to write and their enjoyment of writing. And it was only a small scale, 1 week residential. To expect that to have a direct, instant impact on children's writing was a big ask. But the fact that it changed children's motivation to write was really important. One of the things that did it most of all was this free writing. The opportunity to have creative starting points for writing, to be able to write without fear of it being marked, judged, assessed, targets set on it, goals for achievement. And our teachers struggled with that to start with. We have a very robust inspection regime called Ofsted, who come in and inspect schools. And they were saying, well, what will Ofsted say when they come in and say they've got books that are not marked? Because Ofsted looks at the books. One of the things we said was, what you've got to do is just make clear the difference between these pieces of writing that are starting points, they're ways of getting your ideas going, and drafts and revisions. Actually, one of the schools was Ofsted inspected during the intervention. The teacher said to the Ofsted inspector exactly what we'd said, and the Ofsted inspector singled it out in the report as an example of good practice. Free writing and helping children find out what it is they want to say, engage emotionally with the topic, playfulness, all of that I think is really important. So although I'm now going to home in a lot on that idea of specific language choices and texts, it has to be set in this bigger context. For all of us, it's much easier to have a sense of our authorial intention about something if we actually care about what it is we're writing rather than just doing the task. So the free writing did turn out to be really important. We're now in the middle of another study where we're looking at the idea of transfer and talking with the teachers much more about how they combine explicit teaching with the creative approaches that they got at Arvon, but we don't have the results of that yet. Because I'm talking about text, I've got text examples. What I don't want you to do is think that the text examples reflect the age that you should be teaching this to. The principles of the text examples I've got would apply across the board, but you change the text to suit the children you teach. So I've got one secondary text and one primary text as some of my key sources. The points I'm making are equally applicable across the board. What I want to look at, first of all, is how we notice details in a text and how they're working. And I'm going to read this aloud. Writing is often secretly occurring in your head. The more opportunities there are for children to hear texts read aloud and to read aloud their own texts and to be confident at switching to be the readers or the listeners to their own text, the easier it is to think about your readership. Because as a writer, you're always self-obsessed with what you think you've said. When you hear it read aloud, sometimes you hear things that are different. This is from Of Mice and Men, so secondary text. and it's a description of the setting of where the story takes place. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. Just coming back to those lead principles, first of all, it is an authentic text that I'm using. I'll come to the link later, but now you're going to do the discussion. On the tables, and if your table's big, break into two groups. I want you to look closely at that description of that setting for that story and think about what are the details that Steinbeck is giving you that are helping you to imagine that scene clearly. If you were responsible for filming that scene, what would you be particularly looking for? Or likewise, if you were painting that scene, what would you be putting in? What are the details that are helping you to see it? And is there anything about it emotionally? Is there anything that it makes you think or feel in response to that description? So just have that conversation either in table groups or in half table groups. If I just look at it, first of all, without the blue bits in the text, I think you can see how diminished the description becomes. It's not that there's no description, but if you look at the text, and obviously it doesn't make complete sense without it, what's doing a lot of the work of the descriptive detail for that setting are those blue bits, the prepositional phrases. I've tried to use the colour coding that you're familiar with, and I know that blue is for circumstances. It's slightly tricky for me because I'm focusing on the prepositional phrases, and in that text, some of them are circumstances, but some of them are actually part of the noun groups, so they're really part of the participants. So I may have messed up the colour coding for you there, but it's really, I am focusing on the prepositional phrases and the work that the prepositional phrases do. I've taken the examples out. So if we're doing this with children in a class, simply that act of moving them from the text itself to outside the text helps to really focus on the structures that you're looking at. And then if we move on, what I would then do is try to establish what that link is, that prepositional phrases can be used in a narrative to create precise visual and spatial description of a setting to help fix it in the reader's mind. So that's the link between a choice and its effect. And the word can is important because you don't want to suggest that descriptions of settings always use prepositional phrases to achieve that detail, because they don't. It can be done through those participants, through the noun groups, and sometimes it's done through the verbs, but quite often the noun groups do that work. So I think one of the things there is that you don't want to create sense of prescriptive rules, but just ways of thinking. It is an authentic text, as I said, so we've got all four of the lead principles there. And then the question at the end, looking at the detail that's provided by those prepositional phrases and thinking about how they help with that visualizing and imagining of the setting. So I'd like you to go back to that writing that you did earlier, which was about a setting, really. You were describing a place that was special to you. First of all, just look at what you've written. Look at what you've written and see how specific, even in that free writing, how specific have you been in showing where your place is and where its different features are located and what it looks like. So look at that first, and then when you've done that, look at what you've written and just think, is there anything you want to add or change that really will help that idea of the visualization or even the sensory detail of that passage? And it could be by using more prepositional phrases, but it might not be. So just go back, and that's just in that brain dump, really. It's not in a draft or anything yet. It's just looking at it to start thinking, how well have you captured that sense of what that scene was like? What I'd like you to do now, then, is to share it with a partner. So do this in twos on your tables and a three if it doesn't work. And explain Why do you feel that's successful? Try and verbalise that as clearly as you can. What is it evoking? Is it a visual detail? Is it a sensory detail? It might be a feeling or an emotion that it's evoking that you're successful. And then can you actually say what language choice it is that's helped you to make that successful? That activity is the sort of thing that we would do in the classroom, is encouraging that explicit conversation, not just about something you like, but pinning it down to explaining why you like it and what is it about the language choice that has enabled it to be successful. I didn't scaffold it much for you at all. I left it fairly open. Depending on the age and the confidence of a class, I might scaffold that activity more clearly in order to help children to have a more fruitful discussions. In effect, in that little sequence that you've just done, you've been engaged in a lot of writing talk. What we've done in that sequence is you generated some writing of your own. It hasn't gone far yet, but you could see that you could move now to beginning to write a description of your setting, begin your first draft. So what you've done is just getting your ideas going. You talked in pairs or on tables about how Steinbeck's description of Soledad made you think, visualize or feel. You talked in pairs about how the prepositional phrases contribute to that description, or at least I asked you to talk about what provided the detail. We've looked at those writerly choices that Steinbeck made and linked it to that idea of establishing a setting, and you've shared and explained one of your own writerly choices with a partner. So apart from the first one, which was the doing of the writing, all of those are meta-talk. They're talk about the language and the writing itself, not about the content of it, but about how you're crafting and shaping it. And through that talk, the aim is that you're making a connection between writerly choices that you can make and their rhetorical effect. So in some ways, I've modelled a kind of mini episode or sequence of meta-talk. And this is the talk that I'm looking at in terms of how in the classroom can we refine and improve the quality of that talk. So simply setting up the tasks like I've set them up for you with younger children isn't enough. You've got to think hard about that quality. I just want to look at this idea of the importance of talk. Britain famously said that reading and writing flow on a sea of talk. We've got there that principle, the discussion principle. And one of the things that we've found over successive studies is that the quality of talk, and with that, the capacity of the teacher to create the context and opportunities for quality talk, is absolutely critical to the notion of transfer of learning. And of course, it links to what we know about the importance of talk for learning more broadly, that across the entire curriculum, that notion of dialogic exploratory learning talk is known to be important. And what we're doing here is using that notion of dialogic exploratory talk to talk specifically about the notion of language choices. What it does is it makes visible the connection between language choice and rhetorical effect. And I think it's making it explicit too. Sometimes children implicitly know about those language choices because they may be using, but you'll all know there are children who don't know implicitly because they've not had access, perhaps the kind of reading that they've done or even the oral repertoire that they've had access to haven't enabled them to notice those choices. I'd argue, though, that even if you're a good reader, the explicitness and the visibility is empowering. One of the things that I've noticed for myself as somebody who's been a secondary English teacher, a trainer of English teachers, a researcher of English, doing some of the research that we've done, where we've become more and more aware of the relationship between choice and effect, has had a direct influence on my own writing. I'm much more conscious when I'm writing of the nature of the shaping of what I'm communicating, and I'm much more aware of the choices that I'm making. I've also been much better able to explain, mostly to my PhD students who are second language writers, what it is that they're doing in their writing that needs to improve, when as a first language reader, I have no problem recognizing the difficulty, but in the past I've had problems verbalizing what was causing the problem. Now I'm much more able to verbalize the problem and actually give them solutions to it. So I think that notion of visibility and explicitness are powerful tools for learners in the classroom, and I'd say powerful tools for us as well. In terms of talk for writing, I don't think it's anything new to say that a writing classroom should be a talking classroom. But in general, that talk has been marshalled more to support the content of the writing. It's been about how do you generate ideas? How do you develop the knowledge base sometimes? If you're going to write an argument, there's often discussion work that goes on before the writing of an argument so that you've got enough argument material in order to write the text. And sometimes it's oral rehearsal where you're rehearsing your ideas to a class. All of that talk is really important. I don't want to say that that's not important, but it's talk for the writing. It's talk about the content. What we're specifically interested in is this talk about the writing, about the text itself and the language choices. And so the metalinguistic talk is not just about using language, but it's using language to talk about how language is used. It's that sense of language being the mechanism by which we can reflect on language. And we've used Metatalk because we find it helpful to distinguish this talk from that other talk, which is talk about the content of the writing. And it's also a lot quicker than saying metalinguistic talk, which is really what it's short for. In second language learning, there's quite a lot of research on the value of Metatalk in drawing attention to the specific, it's usually grammar, form-focused attention to the grammar of the target language. And the idea there is that explicit talk about the grammatical structures helps language learners to learn them. We've kind of appropriated it to L1, particularly for this idea of talking about language choice and functionally oriented conversations about grammar. So what then is meta-talk? It's a specific kind of talk about writing that focuses on language use and crucially encourages the articulation of thinking about linguistic choices, verbalizing your thinking about text, verbalizing the strategies you're using. The power of verbalizing is it brings things to the surface that might only be half articulated in your head, as it were, so it brings it out. It's a way to explore that really subtle relationship between what you want to achieve as a writer and your ability to try and imagine whether what you're doing will work for your reader, because those two things obviously go together. The other thing about Metatalk is that from the point of view of teaching, it's a really important pedagogical tool that allows you to get at what is the nature of the learning that these children have picked up from what we've been talking about. It's very easy for children to pick up a misconception from something that you've taught them. You think you've taught them X, they've learnt Y. One of the ways to pick up on those misconceptions is through encouraging this talk about talk, because you hear those misconceptions and get that opportunity to realign them onto the right path, as it were. The other thing about this talk is the notion of it being dialogic. This isn't the talk where you're interested in right answers. There are times for right answers, and later on when we're looking at some examples of teacher talk, there's one episode that I refer to there where the right answer is important for what follows. But this talk is about how do you teach students to think? How do you teach them to make their own knowledge about what it means to be a writer and make those choices? And how do you create the space in the classroom, space for that exploration and the varied opinions? There won't always be agreements about these choices because it isn't about right or wrong. But if you create this space, you hear them say things which you've never thought of, even though you planned the lesson and thought it all through. And they come up with wonderful things that just allow you then to build on that. And we're now looking at writing outside of English, but writing like a scientist, and looking at how do you enable children to understand those language switches that you have to make between writing in different subject areas. And through this, you're going to be engaged in a lot of meta-talk, and you see the role of the talk in doing this teaching. One of the things that we've found really useful are dual texts or hybrid texts. And there's quite a lot of them more for primary around that are really useful. And the two of them here, one of them's an Australian one. And in fact, Claire Saxby, who writes The Big Red Kangaroo, has written several others. I found one recently called Koala, which does the same thing. And Think of an Eel is, I think, by an English author. But they both are dealing with, as it were, the science of how kangaroos live, and in the Think of an Eel, it's the life cycle of an eel that it's looking at. And they have both a narrative story about an eel or a kangaroo, told with all the characteristics of narrative, and then alongside that there's a scientific text which effectively tells the same story but tells it scientifically. So you have this wonderful, in one text, wonderful example of direct comparisons that you can make about writers' choices when they're writing for narrative, which is to entertain or amuse or instruct, and a science text, which is usually to inform or explain. So the Think of an Eel is particularly about explaining, because it's explaining the life cycle of an eel, and Big Red Kangaroo, I think, is an information text about kangaroos. They offer up wonderful opportunities for provoking metatalk. Here, you can see the description of the eel. The narrative text is the long bit, and the scientific text is the short bit, and actually that tends to be a pattern throughout both books. So there's a lesson there instantly that in general, science texts are more concise than narrative texts, which have got the space to go further. I want to read it aloud so that you hear the texts. Just to give you a context, because it's quite difficult when you take a page out of a book, this is when the eels that are born in the Sargasso Sea have swum all the way across the sea to England, or they go to America. They go one of two ways. They are looking for a particular river. They know instinctively which river to go to, and this is when the eel has got back to the right river. Around a drowned oak stump, through twisting green weeds, a mud hole is hidden. Eel knows without thinking it's what he's been seeking. He slips through the ooze. This hole is his home. And then the scientific text, mud holes, burrows, and cracks in the riverbed are all homes for eels. What are the language differences between the poetic text and the scientific text? They're basically describing the same thing. How precise can you be about the language choices that account for the difference in those two texts? The two texts open up that discussion in a way that's much easier than looking at one text and saying, why is this piece of writing scientific? The comparison is much easier. The narrative, it's quite a poetic text. That opening sentence has got a delayed main clause. You've got those two fronted adverbials. They're foregrounded, and it causes a sense of delay and anticipation. This is what he's going through, and there's the mud hole is revealed. It's got descriptive detail that uses words like drowned and twisting that are probably more literary than scientific. It's about an eel. So it's focusing on a particular eel, and that's to get emotional engagement. And that emotional engagement is carried through in talking about his home. There's a sense that he's reached somewhere and he's emotionally happy to be there. The scientific text has got a subject start to the sentence, so straight in with mud holes, burrows, and cracks. It's more direct. It uses precise detail, so none of the lyrical drowned oak stumps and twisting green weeds. It's mud holes, burrows, and cracks. The prepositional phrase is used for specification in the riverbed, and then it's factual rather than emotive. They are homes, but they are just homes for eels. So there's a very clear difference between the choices in the two texts. Later in the story, if you know the life cycle of eels, it's not a good story for the blokes. They swim all the way back across the Sargasso Sea to the breeding grounds. The female lays the eggs, the males squirt the sperm over the eggs, and then they die. After 80 days swimming, not eating, not sleeping, eel's long winding body is worn out and wasted. He spills the new life carried deep in his belly, then sinks through the sea like a used silver wrapper. You can see the lyricism, you can hear the alliteration. It uses metaphor, it uses simile. For Metatalk, collaborative writing is a really good thing to do, because by writing collaboratively, you have to verbalize the choices and the decisions you're making rather than doing it all in your head. And the collaborative writing works best when you're doing quite structured, small tasks. It's very hard to collaborate if you write a narrative together. So rewrite that like a scientist. So this would follow in from some of the work that they'd already done on this text. For example, this is what they come up with. And there's lots of options here, of course. It's back to there not being a right answer. The eel swims for 80 days with no food or sleep, and his body becomes wasted. When he reaches the Sargasso Sea, the male fertilizes the female eggs and then dies. And then it'd be followed through with another Metatalk task about what's changed. What transformations and language choices have you made as a pair between the original and your scientific version to make it more scientific? And could any other changes be made? Because what usually happens is the first version isn't as scientific as it could be. It's on the way to being scientific. And then often the teacher will follow it through by doing some kind of collaborative joint composition together as a class, just to pick out the good bits from all the versions that they've done together. But all the way through, there's that meta-talk about those choices. This is what the actual text said. The male eel's sperm fertilizes the female's eggs in the water. The point about this is not about, what you should have written is that. The point is that's what this writer chose to write. But you might argue it's much better to specify that it's in the Sargasso Sea, because if it's a scientific text, you need to be precise. So you can even take texts that authors have written and then say, well, actually, they'd have been better off. And you know how good kids are doing that when they're given the opportunity. I just want to touch in on another one. What do you notice about the verb tense in this? And how does that link to being a scientific text? And what do you notice about the nouns and noun phrases, the participants? I should say the processes and the participants. Here, it's just reinforcing the idea that in scientific writing, you use the universal present tense. It's the present tense because it's describing something that is and always has been and presumably subject to climate change always will be. And it's the verbs that are doing that. You might talk about relating verbs there as well. And if you look at the nouns and noun phrases, the participants, there's a whole set of the very specific scientific terms, things like marsupial, macropod, habitat, species, proper nouns that are giving you that precision, which you might have said, with the Sargasso Sea would have improved the other one. And also look at the elaboration, the length of those noun phrases, the length of the participants, and all of that is about that additional detail. So looking at how packed information can be in a scientific text. One of the things the teachers we've worked with, at the end of a teaching sequence, possibly over several weeks, will be looking at how do you draw out and consolidate what you've learnt. So they'll ask the children, if you want to write like a scientist, what are some of the writerly choices you can make? Trying to get them to think, well, what have we learnt and can we verbalise it? And that then might be reinforced with a summary, which could include some of these things. It depends what you've taught. You're being really explicit about the choices and what those choices are doing. I want to touch in on your talk as a teacher and how the quality of the management of talk is really critical, and just whiz through the categories, really, of talk that are helpful or not helpful. There are two categories of talk that we found through analysis that were less helpful. One are these right answer ones, the what's in my head questions, which are often framed as open questions, but the kids know that you've got an answer in mind, and they just don't work for exploring. So very little real learning occurs there. The other one is missed opportunities, where children say something, but the teacher moves on and misses the opportunity to pick up on that and move on. Or conversely, where you miss an opportunity to give a very clear explanation as a teacher in response to something a child has said. Missed opportunities are really difficult to be aware of because of the busyness of the classroom. But it's worth just being alert to, am I going so fast that I'm missing the chance, the real learning opportunity that there is in this to pick something up? And then the categories that were really effective, one was checking understanding, and we've included this because these are ones that did have right answers up to a point. So there were closed questions, but they often preceded another question that allowed the teacher to discuss it in a more exploratory way. So it was almost, I just need to check before we move on and have this open-ended discussion that they've got this bit sorted out. And I think it's a really good example of how the idea of open and closed questions being open good, closed bad just isn't true when you really look at learning sequences. There's a time and a place for closed questions that check whether you've understood something. And we did find that very often it created the space for the sequence that followed. And then also opening up questions where particularly why or how questions like, well, why would we use simple sentences? Or how could I make that better? There's no right answer to that, but just suddenly opens up the conversation from one that looks at trying to get at the teacher's head. And the other set was about questions that invite elaboration. In some ways, this is the complement to the missed opportunity. It's where the teacher doesn't take the answer that the child gives and moves on, but pursues it because the answer doesn't really tell her what the child understood. If you look through this, it's all about the choice of a colour, wine red, and it's really about why it suggested witchiness and evil, and it's really that notion of blood. And she pursues this until Ahmed comes up with a broader answer that is more in that, what I would call that area of interpretation that was right. And another one, pursuing, again, they were talking about the effect of a subject inversion, and she keeps coming back. Yeah, but from the reader's point of view, what's happened? Good, but how has he done that? What's he done? So it really goes on pushing for the child to verbalise more what they're saying. So if we bring this to the summary, it was composed of these three things. Those checking understanding questions, and it particularly occurred at the start of a talk sequence. The opening up questions, which really created that space for thinking broadly. And then the inviting elaboration questions, which really were getting the children to verbalise more of what they were thinking and not stopping at the first answer that they gave. And the thing that's common to all those questions is that focus on student metalinguistic learning through Metatalk. Some of the ways to set up peer Metatalk are some of these strategies. And again, what you might think about are what are other activities, practical tasks and activities that are useful for really promoting that discussion, focused discussion about language choices. Metatalk then is that talk about writing which is encouraging metalinguistic thinking. That notion of verbalization, the articulation of your thinking about linguistic choices at the heart of it. It allows you to access what children's metalinguistic understanding is and hopefully to refine it. It also allows us to hear the voices of children as writers and learn from what they're saying. So they may justify a choice they've made and you don't like it. But I think there are times when we have to say, I may not like it. They've made that choice. They've justified it well. They need to be allowed to make that choice. The big skill for the teachers in how you manage that meta talk about the metalinguistic choices, both by whole class talk and through peer talk, and the way that you create that space for meta talk is changing the kind of discourse role that you play as a teacher to being a more open, dialogic discourse role. And I've put on the final slide a link to our website where we've got various resources that you might want to look up that explore some of this if you want to.